History remembers kings, presidents, and generals. But scattered across the pages of history, the ones we rarely read are stories so unbelievable, so powerful, and so human that they almost seem fictional. This isn't a tribute to the well-known. This is a journey into the shadows, where resilience, madness, bravery, and fate collide. These are the 5 most amazing individuals you've never heard of, until now. There are war heroes, there are survivors, there are eccentrics, and then, in a category all his own, there is Lieutenant General Sir Adrian Carton de Wet. To simply describe him as a British Army officer would be to reduce a man who lived through, and in many cases thrived within, some of the most destructive chapters of the 20th century. He fought in the Boer War, the First World War, the Second World War, and several conflicts in between. He was shot in the face, losing an eye. He lost a hand. He survived plane crashes, escaped POW camps, endured torture, and wore all of it, not as burdens, but as badges of purpose. His own memoir opens with a line so stunning in its understatement that it is often quoted with disbelief. Frankly, I enjoyed the war. Born in 1880 in Brussels, Belgium, to an aristocratic family with Belgian and Irish roots, Carton de Wet's early life offered no clear indication of the chaos to come. He was educated at Balliol College, Oxford, not exactly the origin point of many future military lunatics, and seemed on a path toward law. But driven by a sense of duty, relentlessness, or perhaps an early awareness of his own true nature, he left university before completing his degree and volunteered for the British Army during the Second Boer War in South Africa. Here, we first glimpse the kind of mettle that would come to define him. Fighting as a trooper, Carton de Wet was wounded in the stomach and groin. It didn't stop him. After recovery, he rejoined the army, was commissioned as an officer, and proceeded to build a career on the front lines of Britain's most furious engagements. When the First World War broke out in 1914, he didn't just volunteer, he seemed almost drawn to it, as if he had been built for the mud, chaos, and explosive horror of trench warfare. Serving on the Western Front, he lost his left eye in battle. A shell fragment tore it from his face. Later, he lost his left hand, blown off entirely. He tried to keep the use of 2 fingers, but according to his own account, became so frustrated with the delay in having them amputated that he simply ripped them off himself. By this point, his face bore an eye patch. His arm ended in a stump, and he had a persistent limp from various leg injuries. But his determination remained unaffected. He returned to active duty again and again, not out of obligation, but because he was quite simply at home in war. He earned the Victoria Cross, the highest military decoration for valour awarded in the British Empire, for his actions during the Battle of the Somme. But that award tells only a fraction of the story. He continued to serve in multiple capacities long after most men of his rank and injuries would have retired. And it wasn't just his resilience that made him legendary. It was his sheer audacity, the reckless and occasionally comic boldness with which he approached combat and command. On one occasion, during a particularly difficult engagement, he emerged from a trench firing a pistol with one hand while directing troops with the other, an image so surreal it seemed drawn from satire. On another, when captured during World War II after a plane crash in Italian-controlled Libya, he immediately began plotting escape. Imprisoned in a high-security POW camp, he tried to tunnel out, more than once, and after several failed attempts, was eventually released in 1943 in a diplomatic exchange. What's especially curious is that even in captivity, his reputation seemed to command a kind of baffled respect. His captors knew who he was. Everyone did. He was considered indestructible. He was so soaked in military experience that at times he seemed less a man and more a living embodiment of warfare itself, stitched together by bandages and willpower, refusing death out of sheer contempt for it. After his release, he was immediately returned to diplomatic service and sent to China as Churchill's personal representative. There, during the final years of World War II, Carton de Wiart navigated complex diplomatic relations with Chiang Kai-shek, trying to align Allied interests in Asia. Even in this role, he was hardly polished. Fluent in 6 languages, including Arabic and Polish, he retained a gruff, no-nonsense demeanour that often shocked more conventional politicians. But he was effective and universally respected, not because of charm, but because of the weight of his lived history. Few men had seen more, lost more, or returned so often to fight again. He officially retired in 1947 at the age of 67 and went to live in County Cork, Ireland, where he finally, after decades of near constant war, found some peace. His memoir, Happy Odyssey, remains one of the most remarkable autobiographies in the English language, not because of its prose, but because of the almost implausible accumulation of experience contained within it. He speaks of losing limbs and surviving bullets with the kind of detachment most reserve for describing traffic delays. Carton de Wiart finally died in 1963, aged 83. By then, the world had largely changed. The colonial empires he had served were fading. Modern warfare had become mechanized, clinical, increasingly remote. But he remained a relic of an earlier time. A time when men fought face to face, when courage was measured in blood spilled and scars earned, and when some individuals, by sheer will, seemed to transcend the limits of human endurance. Today, he is barely remembered in popular history. His name is known among military scholars, true, and among die-hard readers of British war memoirs. But in an era where bravery is often commercialised and the term hero thrown around with alarming looseness, Carton de Wiart reminds us what true, undiluted courage can look like. A man who lost his eye, his hand, his hearing, who was wounded more times than any record can fully track, and who not only survived, but volunteered again and again and again. He remains, quite simply, one of the toughest human beings to ever have lived. Next up, we meet Lady Death. In the annals of warfare, particularly in the 20th century, when industrialized armies clashed on a previously unimaginable scale, certain names emerge that defy convention. They did not fit the mold of what we expect a soldier, a killer, or a war hero to look like, and none more so than Lyudmila Pavlichenko, a name that astonishingly remains unfamiliar to most outside of Russia or the rare circles of military historians. But to those who know, she is not merely a footnote in the bloody pages of World War II. She is a singular force, a phenomenon, a legend forged in the fire of history's most brutal conflict. Born in the Ukrainian city of Bilazevka on July 12, 1916, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was born into war. The fact is that by every societal expectation of the time, she was supposed to pursue a life defined by education, marriage, and motherhood. She was bright, articulate, competitive, traits that served her well in her youth when she moved from Kiev and enrolled in university to study history. She worked at the Kiev arsenal factory and lived a relatively ordinary Soviet life. But beneath this exterior was something rarer, an innate desire to prove herself not merely equal to men, but superior. She took up shooting at her local club, a Soviet paramilitary training organization where she excelled with startling rapidity. Long before the war came knocking, she was already a sharpshooter of considerable skill. When Hitler's forces invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the German war machine moved fast and without mercy. Operation Barbarossa was unlike any previous conflict the Soviet Union had endured. Cities fell, civilians were massacred. Resistance had to be fierce and immediate. Pavlichenko, then just 24 years old, didn't wait to be summoned. She volunteered, not as a nurse, not as a clerk, but as a combatant, a sniper. The Red Army, initially hesitant to place women in such roles, quickly discovered that Pavlichenko was no ordinary recruit. Her first confirmed kill came near Odessa. It was not just an act of war, it was a moment of personal transformation. In Pavlichenko's own words, as recounted years later, she felt an instant shift from civilian to soldier. Over the next 2.5 months, she would rack up over 180 confirmed kills defending Odessa. When the Soviets were forced to evacuate, she retreated in Crimea, the site of some of the war's most bitter, prolonged fighting. It was there that Lyudmila Pavlichenko became something more than a soldier. She became a symbol. Her confirmed kill count rose rapidly. She stalked enemy officers, artillery spotters, machine gunners. She trained other snipers. She operated in brutal conditions, often lying motionless for hours or even days, to take out a single high-value target. By the end of her active duty, she had 309 confirmed kills to her name. 36 of them were enemy snipers whom she bested in direct duels. This remains one of the highest confirmed totals in modern warfare and the highest of any female sniper in history. And yet, Pavlichenko's story is not just one of body counts or battlefield accolades. It is also a story of how a young woman surrounded by death became a reluctant global icon. In 1942, the Soviet government sent her on a goodwill tour to the United States, Canada, and the UK. The idea was to rally Western support and raise awareness for the immense suffering and resistance of the Soviet people. When she arrived in America, she was barely 25 years old, but already carried more scars, visible and invisible, than most soldiers ever would. And yet, what she found in the United States was not immediate respect, but shallow curiosity. Journalists asked her about her makeup, her skirt length, whether she had a boyfriend, not about the war, not about her expertise, not about what it was like to lie in freezing mud for days to take a single shot. Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the few who treated her with the seriousness she deserved. The two women became fast friends. Pavlichenko stayed at the White House, an experience she later recalled with both pride and surreal detachment. It was during this tour that Pavlichenko gave one of the most powerful public addresses by a foreign military figure in American history. Speaking in Chicago to a crowd of thousands, she took to the stage and declared, "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old and I have killed 309 fascist invaders by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" The silence that followed was thunderous. For in that moment, she shattered the very foundations of gendered assumptions in warfare. Here was a young woman, barely older than a college graduate, who had already taken more lives in defense of her country than any male soldier present could likely fathom. And she had done it not with rage or vengeance, but with methodical, terrifying precision. After the tour, she returned to the Soviet Union, But her days on the front line were over. She was too valuable as a symbol, as a living legend. The Soviets promoted her to the rank of major, and she spent the rest of the war training snipers rather than fighting directly. She later finished her degree in history at Kiev University and worked as a historian and public figure. But like many veterans of total war, she bore the psychological toll quietly. She had seen more than most, done more than most, and carried that weight long after the banners had been lowered and the medals tucked away in drawers. Lyudmila Pavlichenko died in 1974 at the age of just 58. She was buried with full military honours. Today, statues commemorate her across Eastern Europe. She appears on postage stamps. A 2015 Russian film, Battle for Sevastopol, was made about her life. But outside these circles, her name remains tragically unknown to the wider world. She was not just a sniper, not just a soldier. She was a contradiction. A young woman who studied history, yet became one of its fiercest makers. Someone who trained to preserve memory, yet fated to create it with each silent bullet she loosed. Her story stands as a rebuke to all those who underestimate the quiet resolve of those shaped by war. And it is a reminder that courage knows no gender, that resilience can be silent, and that real power often comes dressed not in swagger or brawn, but in unflinching precision and moral clarity. Next up, let's talk about the original Iron Mike. If ever there were a tale that defied both the laws of logic and the resilience of the human body, then it's the story of Michael Malloy. Born in County Donegal, Ireland, sometime in the late 1870s, though exact records are vague, as they often are with those who lived on the fringes of society, Malloy immigrated to the United States in search of work, opportunity, and the elusive American dream. What he found instead was destitution. And by the early 1930s, as the Great Depression cast long shadows over American cities, Malloy found himself in New York City, unemployed, homeless, and wholly dependent on alcohol. To many, he was a forgotten man, just one more vagrant among thousands wandering the Bronx in tattered clothes, begging for change and drink. But to a certain group of 5 men, Malloy became something much more. The unwitting centerpiece in a dark, absurd, and ultimately infamous murder plot that would go on to baffle coroners, enrage insurance companies, and carve a permanent space in the annals of American crime law. These 5 men, Tony Marino, Joseph Murphy, Francis Pasquet, Hershey Green, and Daniel Kreisberg, were not hardened criminals in the classic sense. They were at first glance ordinary working class men, but desperation, greed, and the lure of quick money brought them together in 1932 to hatch what they believed was the perfect crime. The plan was as cynical as it was simple. Take out life insurance policies on a man who wouldn't be missed, and then hasten his death in a way that seemed natural or at least unprovable. Michael Malloy, perpetually drunk and seemingly friendless, was to them the ideal target. With the promise of easy money, around $3,500 from various policies, which in today's money would be close to $75,000, they befriended Malloy and offered him unlimited drinks at Marino's speakeasy. This, they assumed, would be a short endeavour. They believed Malloy's liver, already weary from years of abuse, would fail within days. But the man they had chosen was no ordinary drunk. Malloy drank, then drank more, and more still. He drank wood alcohol, which is a form of industrial alcohol that is toxic to humans. It causes blindness and death. They served him wood alcohol straight, without warning or remorse. He drank it like it was water and survived. At this point, the group began to regard Malloy with a mixture of awe and frustration. He was a man who, by all logic, should be dead several times over. But he would come in, drink poison, pass out, then rise the next day as if nothing had happened, ready for more. When drink failed, they turned to other methods. They mixed him wood alcohol with antifreeze, then turpentine, then horse liniment, even rat poison. At one point, they gave him raw oysters soaked in methanol. Another day, they gave him a sandwich laced with metal shavings and carpet tacks. Malloy kept returning. He not only survived, he sometimes seemed to thrive. As the weeks wore on and the insurance policy sat unpaid, their plan devolved into increasingly reckless violence. One frigid night, after Malloy had passed out from drinking, they carried him outside into the snow, dumped him on a park bench in sub-zero temperatures, and poured water on his chest to freeze him to death. When they returned the next day, expecting a frozen corpse, they found Malloy, alive, confused and shivering, but alive. Eventually, they decided to hit him with a car. They hired a cab driver to run him down at high speed. He was struck and dragged for some distance. Surely now, they believed, the end had come. And for a while, it seemed they were right. Malloy disappeared. Days passed, weeks even. They began preparing to cash in on the policies. But then, as if summoned by some cosmic joke, Malloy walked back into the bar, battered and bruised, but very much alive. No memory of the incident, just a request for another drink. It was not until February 22nd, 1933, that the conspirators finally succeeded. That night, they plied him with alcohol until he passed out. Then, using a rubber hose connected to a gas jet, they pumped illuminating gas into his mouth and held it there. Malloy finally died. However, what followed was poetic justice of the most unexpected kind. The coroner grew suspicious. The police were informed. The press caught wind of the bizarre story. An investigation was launched, and before long, the 5 conspirators were arrested. During interrogation, they confessed to what became known as the Murder Trust, a name that would be immortalized in pulp fiction lore and true crime anthologies for decades. 4 of the men were convicted and sent to the electric chair. 1 received a lengthy prison sentence. Their dark plan to profit off the life of a forgotten man had failed spectacularly, and Michael Malloy, a man who had lived much of his life in obscurity and abject poverty, became a legend. Not because of what he did, but because of what was done to him, and his unthinkable refusal to die. His story, absurd as it may sound, is not a tall tale or urban myth. It is documented in court records, newspaper articles from the New York Daily News, and chronicled in crime history books like The Poisoner's Handbook and The Murder of the Century. Malloy's life is a stark, almost surreal reminder of the indomitable, if deeply unlucky, human spirit. His very survival became an act of accidental defiance against men who saw him as nothing but a disposable tool for profit. And perhaps that's why his story endures, because Michael Malloy, the man who wouldn't die, reminds us that sometimes survival itself is a form of resistance. And now for the ultimate humanitarian, Irina Sendler. In the grand ledger of World War II, a war often quantified in numbers, in scale, in death, the stories that endure most powerfully are those in which individuals defied impossible odds to save even a single life. And yet the story of Irina Sendler is not about one life, Not even 10. It is about thousands. Children, to be specific, the smallest, most vulnerable and most targeted victims of the Holocaust. And at the centre of this extraordinary act of humanitarian resistance was a woman who never fired a gun, never wore a uniform, and never asked for recognition. She simply acted when most chose silence. Born Irina Krzyżanowska in Warsaw in 1910, she was raised in a household where the values of compassion and duty were not abstract ideals, but everyday obligations. Her father, a physician, was one of the few doctors in Warsaw willing to treat poor Jewish patients during a time of widespread anti-Semitism. When he died of typhus contracted from his patients, Irina was just 7 years old. But that act, the risk he took for the marginalised, left an indelible mark. It became, in many ways, the ethical seed from which her later heroism would grow. In the 1930s, she studied at the University of Warsaw and became a social worker. But the outbreak of World War II in 1939 would transform her role entirely. When Nazi Germany invaded and the country was carved up in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Jewish population was quickly corralled into ghettos. By 1940, the Warsaw Ghetto had been erected, a cruel, walled prison where nearly 500,000 Jews were forced into a space of just over 1 square mile. Disease, starvation, and despair were rampant. Irene Sendler, then a 30-year-old employee of the Warsaw Social Welfare Department, saw this horror and knew that charity was not enough. She became one of the earliest members of Zagota, the underground Polish council to aid Jews, the only one of its kind in Nazi-occupied Europe. But she took her efforts even further. Under the pretense of public health inspections, she obtained papers as a nurse and gained legal access to the ghetto, using her credentials to bring in medicine, clothing, and most critically, to smuggle children out. Smuggling is too small a word for what she did. Over the course of roughly 2 years, Irina and her network removed over 2,500 Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto, often under the noses of armed German guards. The methods were desperate, ingenious, and horrifying. Infants were sedated and carried out in toolboxes, sacks, even coffins. Older children were taught Catholic prayers and slipped through in ambulances, sewage tunnels, or escorted out with forged documents posing as Christian orphans. But for Irina, saving their bodies wasn't enough. She wanted to preserve their identities, their names, their Jewish heritage, their family lines, in case there would ever come a day when they could be reunited with surviving relatives. So she wrote each child's name, birth date, and new identity on cigarette papers, which she sealed in jars and buried in the garden of a friend. It was a fragile act of resistance, but one rooted in defiant hope that despite the overwhelming machinery of genocide, these children might one day know who they really were. Of course, such an operation could not remain secret forever. In October 1943, the Gestapo arrested her. She was taken to the notorious Pawiak prison, interrogated and tortured. Her legs and feet were broken. Her body was crushed. Still, she gave up no names. Not of the children, not of her collaborators. She was sentenced to death. But Zagota managed to bribe a German guard, and on the day of her scheduled execution, she was smuggled out. The Germans listed her as executed. She went underground and continued her work under a false identity for the remainder of the war. After the war ended in 1945, the magnitude of what she had done slowly came to light. Although in Poland's post-war Soviet-controlled regime, her work with a non-communist underground network led her being largely ignored or even marginalized for decades, it wasn't until the 1990s that her story began to receive the international recognition it deserved. In 1999, a group of high school students in Kansas discovered her story while researching the Holocaust for a history project. They were astonished that someone who had saved so many lives was essentially unknown. They created a play titled Life in a Jar, which they performed across the United States and eventually in Europe. That play brought Irina Sendler into the global consciousness. She was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007, although the award ultimately went elsewhere that year. She died in 2008 at the age of 98, having lived long enough to witness the world finally begin to say her name. She never saw herself as a hero. In interviews, she consistently said, "I could have done more." It is a haunting statement from a woman who had already done more than most could fathom and who risked everything, not for glory, but because, as she put it, when someone is drowning, you don't ask if they can pay you, you just jump in to help. Irina Sendler's story is not a comforting one. It's not about triumph. It's about doing the right thing while surrounded by wrong. It's about small acts of mercy in an ocean of cruelty. And it's about the weight of survival for the children who lived because of her and for the women who carried their names, literally buried in the earth through the darkest days of human history. And finally, to a man it would seem simply could not be killed, Tsutomu Yamaguchi. There are many ways to measure the devastation of nuclear war. In blast radius, in degrees of heat, in radiation levels, in death tolls. But perhaps the most difficult metric to grasp is that of the human soul. What it means to live through the unthinkable. Not once, but twice. Yamaguchi remains the only officially recognized person by the Japanese government to have survived both atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. His story is not a miracle. It is not even an act of defiance. It is something stranger. The story of a man who stood at the very center of humanity's most violent threshold and walked away from it. Even lived to bear witness. Born on March 16, 1916 in Nagasaki, Yamaguchi lived a modest life. He worked as a draftsman and engineer for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, a job that required him to travel across Japan. In the summer of 1945, with World War II entering its final grotesque stage, Yamaguchi was sent to Hiroshima for a 3-month work assignment. On August 6, 1945, his last scheduled day in the city, he was walking to the Mitsubishi shipping yard when a single B-29 bomber appeared overhead. Its name? The Enola Gay. It carried a payload that would change history. At 8:15 a.m., the first atomic bomb ever used in warfare detonated above Hiroshima with a blinding flash. Yamaguchi was less than 2 miles from the epicenter. The blast ruptured his eardrums, blinded him temporarily, and threw him into the air. The searing heat burned the left side of his body, and he suffered deep shrapnel wounds. His body was scorched, his world annihilated, but somehow, he survived. Dazed and injured, he crawled to an air raid shelter and spent the night among the wounded and dying. Hiroshima was a hellscape. Buildings flattened, fires raged, shadows etched into stone where people once stood. And yet the next day, Yamaguchi, still injured, barely able to walk, began his journey home. It took him several days of crawling, hitching rides and pushing his body past endurance. His destination? Nagasaki. By August 9th, he was back in his hometown, reunited with his wife and infant son. His family was horrified by his injuries, but relieved to see him alive. And yet the horror wasn't over. That morning, Yamaguchi reported for duty at the Mitsubishi office in Nagasaki. Still committed to his professional obligations despite the trauma he had endured. His supervisor reportedly dismissed his tale of an entire city blown up by a single bomb as nonsense, exaggeration, wartime hysteria. And at precisely 11:02 a.m, the second atomic bomb ever used, nicknamed Fat Man, exploded over Nagasaki. This time, Yamaguchi was inside a building, a stairwell specifically. The structure absorbed some of the blast. His burns were reopened, more glass and debris tore into his body, but once again, miraculously, he survived. His wife and child, who had been out searching for burn ointment, also survived, shielded by the thick concrete walls of a tunnel they had entered just moments before the detonation. In the span of 3 days, Yamaguchi experienced something no human ever had before or since. He stood at the epicenter of both nuclear strikes, lived through them, and continued on. But his story was far from over. For many survivors known in Japan, life after the bombs was a new kind of suffering. The radiation sickness, the loss of friends and family, the stigma, the nightmares, the questions. But Yamaguchi spent much of his time in silence. For decades, he said little of what he'd endured. In post-war Japan, those that had survived were often marginalized, seen as reminders of a shameful past, even avoided for fear that radiation exposure might be contagious or hereditary. But over time, as the Cold War grew darker and the threat of global nuclear annihilation loomed, Yamaguchi's silence transformed into advocacy. In 2006, at the age of 90, he broke his silence publicly. He began to speak not just as a victim, but as a witness, a man who had looked directly into the abyss twice, and who now saw it approaching again in the modern world. He spoke to students, to journalists, he wrote poems, and in every message was a simple, unwavering plea that no other generation should suffer what he did. In 2009, the Japanese government officially recognized him as a double survivor. He is the only person to carry that designation. When news of this reached global audiences, some viewed it with disbelief. Surely it had been apocryphal, but the records are clear. His testimony was corroborated by doctors, government archives, and first-hand witnesses. He died on January 4th, 2010 at the age of 93 of stomach cancer. His wife had passed in 2008, his son before that. But his legacy remains etched into history, not because of what he had suffered, but because of what he symbolized. The fragility of life in the face of overwhelming power, and the quiet endurance of one man who had kept going even after humanity had shown its worst. Yamaguchi often reflected on the randomness of his survival. Why him? Why not the others? In interviews, he admitted he didn't know. He rejected the idea of being called lucky. He said there was no luck in nuclear war, only devastation. His survival wasn't a blessing, he said. It was a burden, one he carried so that others might listen. He was not a soldier, not a statesman, not a revolutionary. He was a husband, a father, an engineer. An ordinary man who endured the most extraordinary event in human history, twice. And because of that, he is not simply a survivor of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he is their memory, their voice, their final, urgent warning. The names Michael Malloy, Ludmila Pavlichenko, Adrian Carton de Wiet, Irina Sendler, and Tsutomu Yamaguchi may not appear in most textbooks, but their stories echo louder than most. These were not superheroes. They were human, flawed, scarred, resilient, and in their struggles, they showed us what survival, courage, defiance, and compassion truly look like. If these stories moved you, share them. Keep them alive, because sometimes the most important histories are the ones the world forgets.